couple of years ago, I talked to the director of the Norman Rockwell Museum down in Stockbridge, and she told me the history of setting up the museum down there. And when Norman Rockwell lived in Stockbridge, they decided to open up one of the galleries. And Lori Norton Moffat told me the day they opened up, there was a line down the street and around the corner, and it never stopped. And I think this is kind of a tribute to Norman Rockwell tonight. So thank you for all coming here. What I wanted to talk to you tonight about and get started in our story here, I wanted to talk about art theft and art forgery. It was very much on my mind about 11 years ago, and you'll see how this unravels. We're going to talk about a painting not known to have been missing was found, and that simply was the issue of the day approximately 11 years ago. Art theft is a huge problem in the world, and there's a great, fantastic book, this book right here by Simon Hout. It's Museum of the Missing, and I think it just is incredible, because if you think about the art that's disappeared around the world is intriguing. In our own case, right here in Boston, is in 1990, two thieves ransacked the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. They took a Vermeer's painting called the Concert and 12 other treasures, including 3 Rembrandts. It's just astounding, you know, just one haul. And, but it goes on and on. 1994, thieves break into the National Gallery of Oslo, Norway, stealing the Scream. And that's the one that kids always love. They always draw that on their notebooks and so forth. But incredible works of art. Again, 2008 in Switzerland, 3 armed men in ski masks. Why are they always in ski masks? I don't know. It gives our state a bad name. We're a ski state, aren't we? But they stole 4 paintings, Cezanne, Degas, Van Gogh, and Monet, worth $163 million. It's just incredible. But this is, the art theft world is huge, mostly in Europe, but it exists. Now, art forgeries. Another book that I recommend is The Forger's Spell, written by Edward Dolnick. And it's a wonderful book. Actually, it's about a man named Han van Meegeren from Holland during World War II. Actually was an art dealer, but he actually was a forger as well. And of all things, he exchanged paintings of fake Vermeers with Hitler and Goering. I thought that irony was pretty interesting. But the takeaway in this book is here, no one even knew the crime had been committed. And I think that's interesting about forgery. You don't even know it's happened. Well, I had a little bit of both of these thoughts in my mind as we got into our story. Now, how do we track art? Well, the way museums, curators, and so forth track art is a word that they call provenance. And basically, that's the birth certificate of the painting. It's the time that the artist painted it to the current owner, but it lists how it exchanged all the way through the history of it. For example, this is a catalog by Sotheby's, and you can see there's about 225 paintings that were auctioned off that particular day. This happened to be November 29th, 2006. But if you look at the way they look at the provenance, is always listed in every page. So if you look at in this case, it happens to be the hotel, but it lists the provenance of who exchanged the painting all the way through its life. And in this case, it got down to, there's many exchanges of this particular painting, and then it says acquired by present owner from the above. Well, of course, the present owner at that time was Steve Martin. He was selling his painting at Sotheby's. But this gives you an idea. It's the only way that they really have to at least get a hold on who's got the painting. Now, the next thing is authentication. Well, authentication is a little more scientific. Now we're looking at the artist's signature, maybe the brush strokes. Maybe we're going to look at we could x-ray the painting and see if there's any paint underneath the existing paint. So authentication and provenance are two of the tools that they use primarily by art dealers and museums. I want you to remember that because I had a little bit of experience with both, at least wondering. Now, our story tonight really starts with this man. His name is Carl Anderson. Carl had a fantastic history. He was born about 2 months before Abraham Lincoln was shot. And I always love that connection to history, to imagine that here my father worked with a man who had a connection to that period of time. But Carl kind of traveled around the country for many years as a young boy, almost cut his hand off in his father's mill. But he traveled back to, he got back to, from Madison, Wisconsin, out from Iowa, and back to Philadelphia. And at that point, he became an artist. He took pen and ink lessons, and he began to work for various newspapers, including the World, which was a Joseph Pulitzer paper, and the Journal, owned by William Randolph Hearst. So, and those in about 1898, those two newspapers were in a tug of war, fighting for each other's artists and so forth. I actually have a contract signed by Carl and William Randolph Hearst, 1898. So that's the kind of history he has. Well, Carl was modestly successful in cartooning, but in 1931, he developed this little character to a night class. My father happened to be attending that night class. And together, at the ripe old age of 16, by the way, my father began to work with Carl on this cartoon. And together they traveled all over the world, basically, or I shouldn't say all over the world. They traveled to Europe, they traveled through America on dirt roads in those days. And my father was too young, but he had to share his time with the University of Wisconsin and doing his artwork as well. But it was a fantastic start to his career. Now, Henry, this character just sort of appeared one evening at the night class. The kids loved it, and this is the original sketch that Carl drew, and the gag was, "Does your head feel warmer now, Henry?" And this was now put in the Saturday Evening Post, and it went in 1932. It's March 19th, 1932. And I was hoping that the cover would have been done by Norman Rockwell, but it wasn't. Just a couple lines there. But it was a highly successful cartoon, just a one panel in the back page. And then in 1934, Henry was under contract, of all things, by the Hearst Press, published in more than 400 newspapers around the world. Now, a few years ago, I talked to the museum in Bennington, and we had a small exhibit of Christmas cards. And I told Jamie Franklin, I said, now, I believe Henry had 40 million readers. And Jamie called me back. He said, that can't be. It is. The newspaper coverage around the world was just enormous in those days. So Henry was off and running. Now, Carl and my father continued to draw and publish the cartoon strip now under the Hearst Press until from 1934 to 1948. And this is a picture of Carl, my dad, in about probably one of the last years that Carl was alive. He died in 1948. And the Christmas card to the right, it says, "Be of good cheer," and it shows Henry paying tribute to Carl, and of course his smoking pipe and glasses and so forth. And so it was at that point a moment of departure from my dad. he was now free to really live any place he wanted. So he happened to choose Arlington, Vermont. And this is a picture of the studio where we moved in 1950. It was owned by Mead Schaefer, and I'll tell you in a minute about the history of Mead Schaefer. But he was also a Saturday Evening Post illustrator, and he was highly successful in advertising, and imagine in the 30s the tremendous work that they were doing. The Red Barn was the studio that my dad continued to draw the cartoon strip. And here he is at the board. Then from 1948, he continued to 1994. So there was 60 years of history of the cartoon strip, and then I think they called it a day. Just down the road from our house in the West Arlington, what we call the West Arlington Green, and I'm sure most of you have been there, the old covered bridge. It's now a red covered bridge. The boards have been changed a little bit over the years, but this is where Norman Rockwell lived, right here. And today it is owned by the folks who have joined us tonight, and it is an inn, and it's a fabulous inn, and you should go visit and stay over. The Edgerton Farm is right next door. There was a schoolhouse. There is a schoolhouse right here, the old church, and a beautiful green in back. So it's a wonderful spot, and this is where Norman moved in 1943. Previous to this house, he did have another house down the road, but it burned in 1943, and then that's why he moved to this location. Now, here's Norman, and about 1944 with his family dog Butch, saw us around. Norman was born in New York City in February of 1894, and he, I believe, lived in the golden age of cartoon and illustration. I think of the illustration period from 1860 to 1960, and that seems to be that broad 100 years of wonderful illustrations and art that took place. And he happened to be smack dab right in the middle of that. Norman moved to Arlington in 1939. He had lived mostly in New York. He was born in New York, but he lived in the suburbs for a while. He traveled around. He even went to Europe to test out his skills in impressionistic art and that sort of thing, and it just wasn't for him. So by 1939, some of his buddies who were fishing enthusiasts came up to Vermont, and they said, "Oh my gosh, you've got to come up here, Norman," and he did. And it was love at first sight. And so he arrived. I don't know what happened there. I think what that next bullet was supposed to say was that he did some of his best paintings in Arlington. I mean, we lay claim to that. He produced 322 post covers over his lifetime, and 323 were published. The last one was John F. Kennedy after the assassination, and the Post published that one more time. Now, the Arlington artist group that Rockwell associated with were Gene Pelham. Now, Gene was actually Norman Rockwell's photographer, and he was a tremendous artist in his own right, very skilled, but he had to do a lot of time behind the camera. John Atherton, another local to the Arlington scene, Mead Schaefer, George Hughes. George Hughes produced 225 post covers. Actually, I'll show you the list right here. During this period of 1939 to 1953, you can see 276 post covers, and that didn't include all the advertising, and didn't include the calendars or any of the other things that might have been published in other magazines. Obviously, Rockwell, just was far out and beyond any of the illustrators of that time. In fact, when the Saturday Evening Post knew that Norman's cover was coming out, they would automatically print an additional 300,000 copies because they knew what was going to happen. Now, the first cover that Norman did in Arlington was this, and I'll zip through these kind of quickly, but I just wanted to give you the flavor. This is the Marble Shooter, September 2nd, 1939. And then, of course, he did the Willie Gillis series during the war period. And notice that he had a bit of humor to every cover that he did. He tried to. And even the war pictures, you never saw him with a graphic war picture, but it had this sense of humor. And I think it was settling for the country. Rosie the Riveter, of course, was a famous and still is a very famous painting, May 29th, 1943. Of course, the Four Freedoms. And the interesting thing about the Four Freedoms were completed in 1943. And I think that the most interesting part of that is people were trying to understand the speech that Roosevelt gave in the early part of, I think it was January 1941. So this is about 9 months before Pearl Harbor, and he gave the Four Freedoms speech. And then people in Washington said, we've got to help support this speech, and we need to do bond fund drives and so forth. And it was really the genius of Norman Rockwell who understood you can't put four freedoms into one picture. And he put it into four pictures, and it all made sense. And I think that alone, it sounds funny, but that is the genius that Rockwell understood. By the way, the last painting that he did, I think it was completed in something like May or March of 1943. His studio burned down in about May of 1943, like about 6 weeks later. And if these paintings had been in there, it would have been history. As a result, it was history. It raised more funds for the war effort than any other art or music of the day. And then at the end of the war, of course, there were more covers. This was one of the last ones, and it's the Homecoming Marine. This scene has kind of a funny story because it was taken down in Arlington. Just as you approach Arlington, there's a gas station on the right. And this used to be Benedict's garage. And so Norman approached the Benedict brothers and he said, I would like to come in and do some photos there, and I have an idea for a post cover. And they said, fine. When Norman arrived about 4 or 5 days later, they had it all cleaned up. They had all the gaskets on it. Norman said, no, put it all back. So they did. And then, of course, you get into the gossips, another famous one. And I think the interesting takeaway on this one was Norman struggled with this idea for a while because he didn't want to insult his neighbors. These are all his neighbors in this thing. And he finally thought, the joke's on me. And so then he could finish this painting. Another interesting one is a Christmas Homecoming. I think what's good about this one is that his entire family is in this one. This is Tommy Rockwell and Peter Rockwell over here, Norman here, and Mary and Jerry. And so those are the Rockwell family. Here's Grandma Moses. Here's Meade Schaefer and Meade Schaefer's daughters back here. That person. And then, of course, these are other people we know of the Arlington area, like Ann Brush and let's see, we know this is Sharon O'Neill. Actually, it's the same person posing twice. And, but it's a wonderful, wonderful painting. And, of course, then the Shiner. And this is Mary Whalen. And in this case, this is my father, modeled in this particular one in May of 1953. And then, of course, Saying Grace. In 1958, the Reader's Digest did a poll about the most popular Norman Rockwell paintings, and this was voted #1. And but this was voted number 2. And Breaking Home Ties, and I think it has a lot of interesting symbolism. This was the last painting that Norman did in Arlington, and he literally was breaking home ties. And he was breaking his ties with the Arlington folks who he loved, but it was required that he go to Stockbridge due to the illness of his wife. It's a wonderful painting. It's about 45 inches by 45 inches, so it's large. It's one of the largest ones that he ever did. And I think also I love it because the old farmer was our neighbor, and he was like a second father to me. This is Floyd Bentley, and this is Tommy Rockwell. He used many different models in the same picture. So someone could raise their hand and say, well, I modeled, and they probably did, but maybe they only ended up with his ear or his arm or something. And then this became the final post cover of September 1954. And now, a lot of people said, well, Norman left in 53, and by 54 he's gone, he never came back. Well, that's not true. This is a 1955 photo taken at the Arlington Street Fair. Every year they would cut off the road, and they would direct all the traffic around School Street and trucks and everybody. And then they closed off the street, and they had this wonderful, they had art shows and things for kids and so forth. It was a great gathering. In this case, here's Norman, and here's my dad. Frank Hall was the MC of this particular little event. They were doing a kind of a gag cartoon and illustration thing. Vic Donahue was a cartoonist who also lived in Arlington at the time. Very good friends of all of these folks. And Vic drew Hopalong Cassidy, but he was also an illustrator, later became a painter of Western scenes and lived in Phoenix, or in Arizona. And then, of course, George Hughes, and they're gagging it up here because Vic was leaving for Arizona. Now, in 1962, Norman had a display of his artwork at the Southern Vermont Art Center. And he was, if you can imagine, this is the program, and there's 31 of his paintings. And if you can just imagine today, if you had those 31 paintings in one room, we'd have quite a large audience here, I can tell you that. Now, some of these weren't for sale. Some of these were just not for sale, but many were, including Breaking Home Ties up here, and it was priced on request. So this is the period of June 30th through July 22nd, 1962, and with that, my father approached Norman, and he said, Norman, I've got to buy Breaking Home Ties. And it was a big stretch for my dad. He felt he had just bought another old dilapidated farmhouse. He thought, oh boy, but how is he gonna do this? And he just determined, that's it, I have to approach him and buy this painting. He talked to Norman. Norman said, don't worry, Don, come back after the show and come on down to the studio and we can work something out. My father said, well, what if it sells? And Norman said, oh, don't worry, at that price it's not going to sell. And so anyway, my father was jittery, but he went out to lunch with my mom. They came back after lunch, and there was a red sticker on it. And my father was crestfallen. Oh, my gosh. And Norman let him agonize for a few minutes. And then he walked over and said, Don, it's yours. And this is the check that he gave to Norman for $900, July 2nd, 1962. And he put a little Henry sketch on it. It's all blurted up because of the cancellation, but there's Norman's signature and so forth. And so my father declared that the painting should never leave the valley again. Well, it did. It wasn't long, 2 years later, Norman said, I've got to have the painting. We're going to go on tour. It's a cultural exchange with Russia, with Moscow. It was very icy relationships in 1962. And my father was probably at his wit's end during that period while the painting was overseas. He just worried about it, even though it was really in the hands of Norman Rockwell. Well, by the end of 1964, as you can see here, Norman wrote my dad a note, and he said, Dear Don, I have your original back home. It was the most popular of the picks in the show. They were offered $35,000 to you for it. They said they called you. You must be crazy not to sell it, but I adore your loyalty, as ever, Norman. Now imagine, he bought it for $900, and here's a $35,000 offer right on the table. So it appeared to be a good investment right off the bat. Now you might be wondering what happened. I just skipped a part about the Southern Vermont Art Center. You know, they got a check too. They weren't out of the loop. In fact, the same day I have the canceled check to the Southern Vermont Art Center for $300. So they made a 30% on that sale. And I thought that was interesting because my story had changed a little bit, you know. The painting hung in our living room for several years, the next until 1970, so it's the next 9 years, and 6 years after it returned. And there was another exhibit at the Southern Vermont Art Center. Gene Pelham and my dad were on a committee, and they decided one year, wouldn't it be fun to do a self-portrait? And so my father drummed this one up. And I thought it was pretty neat. In fact, when I saw it, I just thought, my gosh, this is wonderful. And what he did is he put himself in as the old character, so it's a self-portrait. He exchanged the cowboy hats for a palette. He gagged it up with the cartoon character Henry. Now, one woman asked my dad, was that your son? And he said, yes, it is. Now, this is a copyright for King Features. They were always on his back about, you've got to put the copyright on everything you do, Christmas cards and whatever. So he put it on large. And then he put the reform instead of college. And then he put property of Norman Rockwell over here, and they put the Trache Ranch here. One last thing about this, though, if you could see one of these copies closely, and a gentleman came in tonight, so you have to look at it very carefully. This is a Bull Durham tag, and many old farmers chewed Bull Durham in those days. And Norman used that tag in a couple of his artworks. In this particular one, if you look closely, and this gentleman has a copy, it says on there, Bull. And then underneath it, it says Don Trache. So, but you're going to need a magnifying glass to read it. Anyway, this was a successful copy. It was done in 1970, and these are some of the sketches that I found that my dad used to produce that particular piece. So his idea got transformed. Now, by 1974, my parents were going through a divorce. And of course, there's always this division of property. And the biggest stumbling block, of course, was the Norman Rockwell painting. And it really was more than just, it was kind of my father's heart and soul. He loved the painting. He loved Norman Rockwell. And I think that he was worried sick about what was going to happen. And he understood the world. Life goes on. People change. They get divorced, they get remarried, all kinds of things happen. Well, the solution here, and they picked out 8 paintings that were in our household, and including the Norman Rockwell, and then 7 other paintings. And those paintings happened to be part of the household contents, if you will. Well, the decision was to take the 8 paintings and give them to the children immediately. And at that moment of this divorce, 5 of those happened to be in my mother's house and 3 in my father's house. And as far as the children were concerned, that's great. Just leave them right there. We were kicking around the country. We really didn't have ourselves settled down at that moment, so why not just leave it as it is? The other night, I decided to add this, and this is the divorce decree. But I wanted to show it to you because you'll learn about it a little later, that in the divorce decree, you see president in court and all this baloney up here. Well, down here are the 8 paintings. So it lists in that divorce decree the 8 paintings. By the way, I have this exhibit of these paintings in Newport, Rhode Island right now. And I took the divorce decree and I had it framed, and the woman said, geez, I've never framed a divorce decree before. But it's part of the story, I felt. Now, these were the 5 paintings in my mother's house at the time, and I just want you to kind of look at that scene and kind of remember it. They're, of course, Mead Schaefer, Lee Eric, which many of you may know or know of her artwork, another local artist, Virginia Webb, and then 2 Jean Pelham paintings were in my mom's house, and we just said, fine, just leave them there for now. In my father's, now he's in the process of building a place, and he was storing the Norman Rockwell, the George Hughes painting, and a Claire Weintz, another local artist. So these were the 3 that were in his home or in his studio. This is a picture that was taken later, but basically this became his studio. Of course, he kept adding on to it, and it began looking like an octopus, but it's where he then made his home and his studio and kept the artwork. Now, okay, by 2002, so we've gone from 1970, where he did the caricature, and then we went through the divorce of 1974, and now we're all the way up to 2002. So roughly 30 years later, my sister, my older sister, you know how older sisters are, she was bugging me. But she was right, too. She said, Don, you've got to do something with this painting. Well, with that, I went to the Norman Rockwell Museum, and I said, would you be interested in storing this painting? We'll put it on loan. They said, we haven't seen it in 50 years. We'd love it. So with that, they had a show coming up in 2002 called the Arlington Years, and they had a wonderful exhibit at that time. And I do remember, though, going to the exhibit. And imagine, if you've never been to the museum in Stockbridge, you must go. And it's a couple things. One is you'll see a lot of people that maybe you recognize in these paintings. And the other thing is just the quality of the artwork itself. It's amazing because his paintings just jumped out at you. You know, they were intense. I remember, though, when I walked in and I saw our painting, I wondered, because it was a little softer than the other paintings. Something was a little different, but I didn't dare say anything. Why would I? And so I just thought, well, maybe that's the way it was. But by 2004, now the painting's been hanging in the museum, and now questions are beginning to loom about the painting. Other people are recognizing something may be different, but we didn't know what. Now, by 2005, my dad dies. This is in May of 2005. And the clues begin to emerge. One of the first clues, or major clue, was this, the folks from Illustration House in New York contacted me and they said, we would like to hang the Mead Schaefer painting that we know you have. And I said, that would be great. I leaned over the banister in my mom's house, took a snapshot. Of course, it glared back. It was a terrible photograph. I sent it down to them, and they said, as it turns out, we don't need it. But we think something's different about this painting than the original. And they sent me a tear sheet, meaning the original magazine article with the picture. And then they give us this description here in this letter, and their theory was that Mead Schaefer actually repaired the painting. Well, I just shrugged my shoulders. I said, well, it's the craziest thing I've ever heard. I know that painting. In fact, I met Mead Schaefer when he handed the painting over. So I just didn't understand it. And I shrugged it off. You can see how dense I am, you know. Another man came forward. This is Mr. John Howard Sandon. Well, he visited the museum in about that same period of time, about 2003, somewhere in that period, 2004. And he was outraged. He walked in and he said, this is a fake. This is a replica painting. What are you doing? And he ended up writing 7 letters to the museum, unbeknownst to me. I had no idea that they were receiving letters or that there was this outcry. The museum was really kind of protecting us. They were glad that we offered the painting on loan, and so they kind of protected us from this, shielded us, if you will, from the onslaught. Well, this man, in fact, declared that it was a third-rate replica. Well, not only was I annoyed, I was a little mad. I thought, well, of anything, I think it's a pretty first-class replica, if you want to know. Now, another thing, when my dad died, we had a service for him, and we took some paintings up to the service. And when I got back, I was putting paintings away, and I went into one of the cupboards, or went into the closet, and lo and behold, there's another painting. There was one painting on the wall, and I walked out, and I showed my brothers and sister, and I said, I don't understand it. Why would George Hughes make 2 identical paintings? It didn't make sense. And I know the day that George Hughes brought this to our house, he walked in. My dad was thrilled with it. I didn't particularly get thrilled about the painting. I thought it belonged in Florida or something. But I shouldn't say that today, should I? But it was of a beautiful scene. But George was very happy. He said, Don, I did it with a putty knife. And so he was pretty excited about his painting. But the question is, why was this? Now, so there was another clue that was coming to me. Now, this is all happening in the year 2005. These clues were coming at me right and left, and I'm not taking the bait. So by January of 2006, now keep in mind, this is about 8 to 9 months after my dad's death, and all this was going on, and I decided, why don't I contact Illustration House in New York, go make a visit, and put my ear to the ground and see what's going on. Now, at the same time, I called Sotheby's. Now, Sotheby's had already done, they actually made a beautiful catalog for us and so forth, because they were always interested in selling it in the future. Well, unfortunately, Peter Rathbone at Sotheby's was out when I visited in January, and he returned the call immediately and just called me incessantly every day, it seemed. Don, you've got to put your painting in the May auction. The market is hot, and now's the time to go, and so forth. Well, of course, now I have 1,000 questions. And I thought, how are we going to do this? And I just knew at that moment, there's no way I could put this painting up for sale. There's just too many questions. So I posed it to Peter Rathbone at Sotheby's. I said, how would you authenticate the painting? He said, authenticate it? That's ridiculous. The provenance is perfect. I said, yes, it is. How stupid of me to even ask. But during the same period, about February of that same time frame, my brother Dave was snooping around in Dad's studio, and he found in a packet of pictures 2 interesting photographs. And this really led to the final discovery. These 2 photographs we examined over and over and over again, and they were taken in my dad's, this is the window light of his studio, and we tried to examine this, and we just couldn't figure out what was going on. we thought, well, there's a coloration difference a little bit here, but that could be by lighting of the photography or whatever. And so we determined, geez, we just don't know what is happening here. We blew the pictures up and it became more evident. We actually made a trip back to the museum and said, what do you see in these paintings? And of course, we listened to the curator at the museum, and she began to tell us this and that. But we had discovered that there was a little bit of difference here in the face of the boy. And we looked back and forth, and we tried to examine it, and we tried to understand what was happening. But keep in mind, we're only looking at one painting now. We only have one painting, but we have these two photographs. So the theory evolves. Now my theory, number one, was, okay, maybe my father had an accident. What if he spilled something on the painting? But we also have the negative strips. Aha, that would tell us. So logically, we would see what appears to be the original, and then what appears to be maybe the made-over painting. No, it was reversed. So that blew that theory right out the window. So sorry about that. So night after night, my brother and I would discuss. I was living in Burlington. David was down here in Arlington. And night after night, we would discuss what's going on. And I said, okay, this is my hen scratching. But I said, there's only 4 possibilities in the world. And that was, my dad would always say that. We'd sit at the dinner table and say, what are the possibilities? Well, here were the possibilities. Number 1, no change at all. Maybe it's just a figment of everyone's imagination. Maybe there is no change. We just think there's a change. Maybe conservation was done, back to authentication and back to the theft. I thought, gee, is it still in Russia? Is it in Moscow? Is it in, who knows where? Third possibility is maybe the accident. I still had to cling to that idea. Maybe something happened. Maybe I didn't really see the negative the way I should have. And the final idea was maybe he made a copy. And I think that was the most outrageous idea in the world, but I had to put it down as a possibility. Well, by March 13th of 2006, now we're talking, this all happened in a period of about 3 months. In March, I convinced the Williamstown Art Conservation Group to bring the painting back. I said, I don't care. X-ray it, do whatever you have to do. My theory at that point was, and my hope was, that someone had painted over part of the painting, but it was the original. So my hope was that we would find that out. By X-raying the painting, we could see what's underneath. Well, I got some news back. And the news was, we have your painting here in the lab. Your painting is very clearly by Norman, from the bluish underpainted outlines to the lighting and the brushwork. And we have seen many Rockwells here. These typical handling details are not easily copied. Okay, that's pretty good. But then came, there's no evidence of tampering or repaint in the face of the boy. And when I read that, I said, uh-oh, we have a problem. It has to be a replica. Because how could you account for a change if there's no change? So this is March 13th. With that, my brother and I just made and by the way, we couldn't tell anyone. We couldn't breathe a word of what we're doing. We didn't want to expose this problem to anybody. And we began to look in the studio. It's the only place we could begin to look, and hopefully we'd find some evidence of something, some historical thing, piece of paper. Now, of course, we never considered my dad would actually have the skill to even do this painting. The first week, we found a large canvas, and it was about 60 inches. It's way beyond what normally you would find in my dad's studio. A piece of evidence, a shipping crate, which did hold the original Norman Rockwell painting, but it was empty. So that was of no avail, but it kept us looking. And with that, my brother called me and he said, I don't know what it is, but he said, I think I found something behind a wall. Now, I didn't know what that meant. I'm in Burlington, he's in Arlington, and I'm thinking he's down in the basement someplace, and he's doing something in a construction wall. He said, there's a canvas behind the wall. I can see the staples, but I think it's larger than the Rockwell painting. I said, well, we'll go down, we'll tear the wall down if we have to. Well, the next day, we looked at this particular spot, and this is the little piece that my brother discovered. Right here is a little crack, and he didn't understand why. This happened to be a photographic copy at the time that the museum gave us to put in place of where the original was. Well, here is where we discovered this little gap in the wall. Notice it's interesting. Here's the bookshelves coming out, and they miss this crack, but why would the wall return like that? Once you begin to study it, you begin to ask these questions. Notice also there's a grand piano right conveniently in front of the wall, so no one would ever touch it. It didn't take us, I don't even think my brother and I talked to each other. We just immediately went to the wall, we looked at it, and we began to discover we could take it apart like a tinker toy. And here you can see my brother, we removed the books, and we're removing the bottom shelf here. And it's an enormous shelf. It's a wide shelf, wider than usual. We were removing the valance boards, top and bottom. And once we did that, now we could actually pull the wall in front of the bookcase. And when we did that, my first gasp was, I saw the two Gene Pelham paintings and this, and I thought, uh-oh, I don't think I should say what I said, but a couple things hit me. One was this wonderful smell of oil paint that came out of that wall. They've been tucked away now for 30 years or longer. And it's like, it almost brought me back to my childhood. I just remember that smell. The other thing that struck me was, of course, that's how you'd hide a painting. You wouldn't put it in, you wouldn't roll it up. That would be blasphemy. You keep it on the wall. So here's the original wall, and merely put a fake wall in front of it. It's tucked away from heat, cold, bugs, varmints, and everything. And here, remember the 5 paintings that I showed you earlier in my mom's house? Well, lo and behold, here they are. The difference is these are the originals. And I said, oh boy, this is not going to be good. Well, moments later, we knew we could slide the next wall. So this 4x8 sheet of paneling we could nicely slide because my father put this on a nice caster system. The first wall he couldn't. He had to carve the runners for the wall out of wood so no one would ever notice it. Here we are uncovering the Rockwell, and you can see in the next slide, there it is. There's the original. And yes, sir. That is. Yeah. So here it is, uncovered after 30 years. And so with that, I had to call the museum. This happened on a Friday night, and it was St. Patrick's Day. So forevermore on St. Patrick's Day, I'm going to be Trache. But and now I had to wait the weekend before I could go to the museum. Now once again, oh my gosh, we found the paintings. They're in excellent shape, but we can't tell anyone. We didn't dare tell anyone. So like blood brothers, we had to keep another secret for another 72 hours. And the next day, we went back to just my brother and I went back to the studio, and we opened it up again. We said, okay, we've really got to look. We've got to make sure of what we're seeing here. And you'd be surprised. Now here they've been tucked away for 30 years. Oh, I worried all night. Is the place going to burn down? Is the burglar going to come? What's going to happen? And of course, they were just fine. And the paintings more. And so on Monday morning, following Monday morning, I went down to the museum in Stockbridge. And I said to the curator, she greeted us as normal. She said, "Oh, thank you for coming in. Would you like a cup of coffee?" And so I said, "No, we want to talk to you in private. And we have something to tell you." And I said, over the weekend, we made a discovery. We discovered that the painting that you have here in the museum is indeed a replica. We know where the original painting is. We know it's in excellent condition. Well, with that, she said, "I think I better get the director." And we sat all day deciding what to do and how to handle this situation. Because it's a big no-no to have a replica in your museum. The following day, the museum did come up, and here they are removing the original, and you can see the breaking home ties and this is my brother. And by that following Friday, we took all these paintings, all 16 paintings, actually 17, down to the museum, and I thought, okay, now it's really going to be apparent which is a fake and which isn't. Well, it wasn't so apparent. Actually, we put them side by side, and they were pretty darn good. And this was the first time that we could see the replica and the original side by side. And of course, we had all the other paintings over here. Here are the two Schaefer paintings, and here are the Hughes paintings, and so on and so forth. And, it just gets carried away. It filled up this whole... But the museum had to keep it a secret now. They didn't want to tell anyone. So here we are, now we're undercover for another 2 weeks. We can't say a word. It was very, very frustrating. Finally, on April 6th of 2006, the museum displayed the original, and they did a fantastic job. And they framed it, they reframed it, and then on the opposite wall from the original, they put the replica. And it's strategically placed because during this period of discovery, we didn't see two paintings, you see, and we could see one painting, but now we have to look the other wall. So you have to use your memory at the museum to understand it. Anyway, it was a huge success for the museum. They just loved it. And here's some other artifacts, a cartoon strip. Here's that gag that my dad did, the self-portrait, and various other things that were displayed, and open to the public. So it was quite a moment, and I think that my feeling at that time was, thank God we didn't lose a Norman Rockwell. I thought our family could have lost maybe one of the most famous paintings, and so it all came true. So I think that was the biggest thing in my mind was it was back. Even Robert Waldrop came up. He was a model for the boy, and he came up from Texas, and he modeled at that time back in front of the original. Some of the details that we looked at, and in comparison, of course, I'll share with you. Notice how much lighter this is than this, and this is the original painting, and this is my dad's replica. And one guy said online, he said, if your dad only used color-fast paint, this wouldn't have happened. That was probably the only negative that I ever read about it, because it is fascinating. And then, of course, our concentration was around this boy's face. And this was the area that we felt had changed. When you look at the original, the eyes of the boy are riveting. And your eyes go right to his eyes and his expression. In this case, not so good. So, and here is maybe a little sharper, but you can see, and then it leads to another question. Well, if my father could copy every detail, every hair on the dog, every part of the cigarette, the hats and everything, so why would he mess this up? It's a question. Well, by the end of that year in 2006, I got a letter from Guernsey's in New York. And who knows, but at that time, the guy said, look, he said, sometimes artifacts lose value. And he gave me some examples of that. And I did worry. I thought, is Norman Rockwell going to survive? You know, will his notoriety continue? And I worried about it. And not only that, then I also worried, what are you going to do with this painting? You know, where is it? It's going to be, you know, infinitely at a museum or so on. Well, we went to Sotheby's. And the interesting part, if you've never been to an auction, you must go. The original painting is here, and they put it on exhibit about 5 days before the auction, and I'm telling you, it looked like the jewel of the Nile. It was fantastic. And and here it is. It comes up on this turntable type of thing, so the painting comes out. By the way, these paintings, many paintings sell for, $100,000, $200,000, $300,000, and they sell like that. I mean, if you think about your house selling, and it takes sometimes months and years, these paintings sell in seconds. This one took a little longer, and but the bidding kept going up. So here I just wanted to describe that. Here's the gallery. Here's Peter Rathbone, the gentleman that I dealt with, and of course here's the images on there were two large screens on either side of the auction block. And then, of course, there's staffs of people from Sotheby's up and down. They're all over on phones and so forth, taking bids and so forth. And then here's the monetary values in many different monetary, it could be Chinese or Japanese or yen or whatever. It was exciting, and it went on the block and sold, and commanded the highest value of any Norman Rockwell painting of that time. So it was worth finding. Now, one final clue. We did discover in my dad's safe this image, and it was done on just old yellow line paper. You can see the bookcase, and you can see the outline of all the paintings. It's the Rockwell, the Pelhams, the Schaefer, and Eric and Webb. So there they are. To this day, we don't know if my dad did it for himself as a reminder or for us as a clue. It's a mystery. Also, John Sandon was proven correct, and he was forgiven, and I think he forgave us. I never met the man until about 2 months ago. And so imagine, so for the last 11 years, I never really knew about him, and he came up to our studio, and is a wonderful portrait artist, and he's highly successful. And here he has given a lecture at the National Museum of Illustration in Newport last month, and he copied the boy, and he described his experience of doing this illustration and the difficulties of doing that. He's a wonderful artist, and you'll hear more about him at some point. Oh yes, we have one more problem. They all seem to step in. And, okay, so they did a 2-year investigation, and it was based on a newspaper article that was interviewed by me. And they said, well, why don't you talk to me? Well, but it's in the newspaper. Well, I know, but I gave them the information. So I didn't start out well with them. They went on and on and on. They determined that the painting was not a completed gift to the children because it was hidden behind the wall. Let that be a lesson to you. And I don't know how to explain it other than that. They completely, in my opinion, ignored the divorce decree, which explicitly laid out those paintings. And but it's like marching against a steel wall, and eventually we came to some agreement. Finally, these are the what ifs and the whys. And why would he do it? Well, money, I don't think so. In fact, he thought it was abominable to even suggest money for this painting. He worshiped Norman Rockwell too much. And through the years, Ross Perot would call us and wanted to buy the painting in the worst way. And I'll share this with, actually I'm kind of wired up, maybe I shouldn't share it. Typical of my dad, Art would know this. Ross Perot called my brother. And so I said to Dave, well, we better go tell Dad. So we went up to the studio and told Dad, and I said, Dad, Ross called again. His response was, oh, damn. And so that's what happened was when I put the Rockwell painting in the museum in 2002, I asked the museum if I could have 2 full-size color copies of the painting. And they said, certainly. So I had one frame, and the other I rolled up and sent to Ross Perot. Well, this was in 2002, but in 2006, I decided I better call Ross. And I called him up, and he said, you've got some story going on up there. He said, I said, well, look at it this way, Ross. You have one of 2 copies of a replica in the world. And he said, I'll tell you what, I'll take it to Sotheby's, we'll sell it, and I'll split it with you. Was it a prank? No. However, if you think about the replica he did, or the portrait, self-portrait, I think there's a little prankster in him, and but that wasn't the full reason. Was there fear? You bet. There was fear of losing the painting. And it wasn't the fact necessarily losing it to my mother, it was just the fact that it would be lost to our family, and I think that was his concern. Was there distrust? Yes, he had his nature was to be distrustful in a certain sense, but really I believe it obviously was the divorce, that's what triggered it, but I think in the end he discovered it's a piece of security. He could build a wall and keep this painting, and it was secure, out of sight, and I think that those are some of the whys, but it's open to the rest of you to figure out other whys and what ifs. So thank you very much.